Good afternoon, everyone. This is the April 27th, 2021 meeting of the City Finance Committee. And may I get a roll call, please?
Yes. Committee Member Gutierrez?
Here.
Committee Member Harmon?
Here.
And Committee Chair Friedman?
Here. Thank you. We are all present, so we'll move on to our agenda and on to public comment. Is there any member of the public who wishes to speak to any item not on today's agenda, but under the purview of the Finance Committee? Mr. DiMartini, do you see anyone who has their hand raised?
Chair Friedman, I am monitoring public comment and I do not see any hands raised at this time.
Great, thank you. I'll close public comment and move on to our first item of the day, which is the American Rescue Plan Act. I'll turn over to you, Mr. DiMartini, for the presentation.
Excellent, thank you very much. Chair Friedman, committee members, my name is Keith DiMartini. I'm the city's finance director. It is my pleasure, along with a few of my colleagues, to present an overview of the recently approved American Rescue Plan Act. There will be some financial relief and rescue funds that will be distributed to the city of Santa Barbara over the course of the next year and a few months. And so this presentation will provide a really brief overview of the many, many programs that are involved in this ARPA legislation. Next slide, please. The agenda for today's presentation is to provide a really brief overview of the American Rescue Plan. It's also commonly referred to as ARPA. It will talk about the many resources that are available under this plan for businesses across the country. It will also talk about many of the resources that are available to individuals as well. Many of those funds have already been distributed to individuals as of today, actually. There is a specific program in ARPA that provides specific rescue funds for state and local governments. That will be the primary focus of today's presentation. We will talk about the impacts of COVID over the past year and a few months, specifically in regards to the city's revenues and other impacts and how the city can use those funds. We'll provide a staff's recommendation to the committee today and be happy to take any questions you might have. Next slide, please. So just to provide a really brief overview of the ARPA program, next slide, please. President Biden signed this ARPA legislation into law on March 11th, 2021. It does follow the CARES Act, which was signed about a year earlier. The ARPA program is one of the largest relief packages ever legislated and approved by the President of the United States. It calls for $1.9 trillion of stimulus and recovery funds in response to the continued impacts of COVID-19. The ARPA program does include new funding for about $350 billion for states and local governments across the country to provide some relief. Just like the city of Santa Barbara, many municipalities throughout the country have experienced revenue loss and other financial impacts directly related to COVID. And so this particular program helps offset some of those losses and allows the city to continue to provide services to the public. Next slide, please. There are many pieces of the pie for the ARPA program. There are direct stimulus checks that individuals will be receiving. State and local governments get a small piece of the larger program. There's unemployment benefits, tax credits, direct assistance and recovery monies for restaurants and bars and other businesses. And so let me now turn it over to my colleague, Jason Harris, the city's economic development manager. He'll present the next slide, please, and go into some detail about all the programs that are involved in ARPA. Jason, thank you.
Great, thank you, Mr. DiMartini. Again, Jason Harris, city's economic development manager. And before I launch into a series of about 8 slides highlighting the various programs and assistance of the American Rescue Plan, I would also like to highlight for the committee and the public watching is there's also assistance that has been provided by through the state. California is providing financial assistance to businesses and residents in a variety of programs and resources, as well as philanthropic organizations, and even the county has issued assistance. And most notably, we've seen the rental assistance that the county has recently issued for county residents. So with that, next slide, please. So the American Rescue Plan, as Mr. DeMartini was referencing, is a combination of building upon the CARES Act program that was put in place and funding and expanding or extending various programs, and in some instances creating some new programs and funding. So here on this slide, you'll see that the highlights hereof, there's a restaurant relief fund that's been created to be administered by the Small Business Administration. This funding is set aside for smaller businesses in the form of grants, as well as up to larger businesses, up to $10 million, larger businesses having, kind of a small franchise of up to 20 business operating units. There's also a small business credit incentive program that's been established for low interest loans for small businesses. And then this new program, a community navigator program, it's to be managed by the Small Business Administration, make grants or enter into contracts. And this is really for community based organizations, nonprofits, potentially local governments. But when I think of this as like the Women's Economic Ventures or Economic Development Collaborative, where they're providing a resource and facilitating the coordination of these various programs. Next slide, please. So continuing on here, you'll see some of the highlights, and this would illustrate where the American Rescue Plan is funding the extension of programs that were established by the CARES Act. So you may be familiar with some of the acronyms that have been produced, the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP. This has been refunded at $7.5 billion and extending that program. They're now also expanding to include nonprofits that will be eligible through that. There's also the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, again, an existing program that was created through the CARES Act, extending funding through that at $15 billion. This is available until unexpended, provides grants through economic aid to hard-hit small businesses, nonprofits, and venues, underserved businesses through that program. We also had two new programs established here, the Shuttered Venues Operators Grants. This is really going to those performing art theater type of venues that we have a fair amount throughout the community, the Loberos and ensemble theaters, things of operations such as that. We'll have resources available, grant programs. And then the Small Business Administration is the traditional pipeline for federal benefit and assistance programs for businesses to gain assistance. And so they're getting funding of $1.3 billion to aid in a variety of programs that they have. Next slide, please. And then the other side, if it's not the Small Business Administration, it's the Economic Development Administration is the other agency, the federal government. They're receiving funding to help aid local communities rebuild their economies, and $750 million of that is being allocated to travel and tourism, outdoor recreation. We've yet to see programs being formally established, so they're just now funding the EDA, and so we'll be tracking where there's opportunity there. And this one area is where, for instance, the commercial fisheries industry is pursuing, grant funding, for instance, is one example. There's also funding $175 million to fund community organizations. Small Business Administration would be, the pipeline to facilitate providing resources to partners and community financial institutions, working with minorities, immigrant, and rural communities through that program. And then an employee retention credit. So this is, again, an existing program that was established under the CARES Act. And this is funding that program, extending that program out till the end of this calendar year. And this is providing tax credits for businesses that rehire employees that had been laid off during the pandemic. Next slide, please. And then this is a kind of an overview of just highlighting we are really fortunate here in Santa Barbara to have access and support and assistance by three really high-performing business assistance organizations. So Economic Development Collaborative supports the Santa Barbara County region, Santa Barbara specifically under that. They provide free business consulting and loan support. Their contact information is listed. I meet with all three of these organizations on a bi-weekly basis to exchange updates and information and collaborate on outreach and assistance. city is routinely pushing out the various webinars and training programs that these organizations are collectively producing on a weekly basis. SCORE, that's the Service Corps of Retired Executives. Again, Santa Barbara is very fortunate to have a very strong SCORE program here locally. Again, free mentorship, webinars, online resources that organization's producing. They've stepped up dramatically during this COVID pandemic recession. And then lastly, the Women's Economic Ventures, again, another powerhouse here in our community. Originally focused on women entrepreneurs, but they've expanded their program offering kind of throughout the community. All three of these organizations also provide Spanish language assistance and to Spanish language speaking businesses and entrepreneurs. We've contact information online. Next slide, please. So now I'll transition into the American Rescue Plan resources for citizens, individuals throughout the United States. Next slide, please. And not too dissimilar from that earlier reference, there's a combination of some new programs and or funding existing federal agencies and programs, providing a range of services. So here I'll just have a series of slides highlighting the wide range of assistance that's going out to various areas of need throughout the United States. So homelessness, supportive services, and housing is being funded at a rate of $5 billion. Emergency housing vouchers. This is again assisting families that are in an emergency housing condition and transitioning them into temporary housing on the short-term basis. And then housing counseling services. This is funding through Neighborhood Reinvestment Corporation grants to transition folks into stable, longer-term housing. And then lastly, as we all know, and this was kind of one of the big hallmarks of the American Rescue Plan is in addition to the stimulus checks, was unemployment benefits. And so that's been funded additional unemployment benefits at $300 per week up till September of this year, continuing that original federal unemployment assistance. Next slide, please. In additional housing support is also emergency rental assistance. And here you can see kind of the hallmarks. Many of these programs do have income thresholds of eligibility, of either having some hardship or some area median income thresholds, not inconsistent to other existing programs. Homeowner assistance funding, again, this is providing mortgage and utility assistance that will be coming forward. And then one program specifically for energy and water bills. As we know, we've seen a lot of cities put moratoriums on any utility shutoffs. This is really to facilitate and help those residents and citizens recoup those obligations. Next slide, please. In addition to the unemployment insurance benefits, one of the hallmarks, probably the one that got the most attention, was the stimulus checks, the $1,400 for qualified income individuals, residents throughout the United States at $1,400. That has rolled out broadly, and as one of those really kind of initial stimulus payments to kind of, again, get money flowing into the economy. The earned income tax credits, this is for individuals, again, qualifying throughout the United States. Kind of the prerequisite here is individuals have to file federal income tax to be able to take advantage of this tax credit. And so I think as we go forward through future tax years, we'll be wanting to provide coordination with our community partners, assistance to individuals to complete their federal tax forms to take benefit of these various programs. Child tax credit also is in flux and is rolling out. It's still being defined as how this program is going to be implemented from benefits, but a pretty dramatic benefit for those with income eligibility and obviously the requirement of having children in dependence on your under your tax thresholds. And then paid leave credit. So this is extending sick leave and federal leave assistance, both in associated to pandemic relief, but then overall offsetting impacts to local governments that have any federal tax benefits related to these programs. Next slide, please. And then just lastly, kind of rounding out kind of the human service, there's additional benefits and extension to SNAP. So this is again for nutrition and what was formerly kind of called as a food voucher, food stamp type of programs. So there's been an increase in extension to that. Education, colleges and universities are getting financial assistance through this program, and also directly to students with emergency financial grants. So both helping the institutions as well as eligible students. And then childcare, both assistance going out to childcare providers to ensure that those organizations are able to reopen or continue operations that they've obviously either closed or scaled back with pandemic restrictions, as well as going into federal programs offering childcare services. And then just lastly, this is kind of the last slide I'll present to is, again, this was kind of high level, obviously very summary as Mr. DeMartini was referencing. In addition to that 1.9 million trillion package, there's also federal program services going for mental health services, skilled nursing facilities, COVID vaccination activities and programs. Public health care providers are getting reimbursement, substantial benefits going to tribal governments throughout the United States, elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds. So the elementary school systems and high school systems are receiving funding, and a wide range of other forms of assistance. So we were just really scratching the surface broadly. And again, I'll be available for any questions in the presentation. Next slide, and I think we'll be transitioning to Mr. Sewell in finance.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Harris. So my name is Mark Sewell. I'm the accounting manager for the City of Santa Barbara, and I've got a few slides here to just kind of hone in on the funding available to the city. So next slide, please. So as Mr. DeMartini mentioned in his overview of the 1.9 trillion, 350 billion has been carved out for state and local governments. And of that, 130 billion is then for county and city governments, split 50-50. So counties will receive 65 billion and cities will receive 65 billion. And so there's obviously an allocation methodology that is needed to actually work out how much each city will actually be eligible to receive. And within the law, it was determined that a CDBG modified formula will be used. And so they take into account elements such as population, poverty levels, and housing instability to determine ultimately how much each city and county will receive. The funds are in law, are required to be deposited to the cities and counties within 60 days of enacting the law, and the law was enacted on March the 11th. And it was written that 50% of the total allocation is due within 60 days. And so therefore we are anticipating about $11 million before the end of May. And then the other 50% coming in a year's time. And the reason we say 11 million, because we've received our allocation estimates, and they still are estimates because these CDBG formulas do flux as they continue to work through them. But we think we're going to receive some in the range of $22.5 million as a total, of which, as I said, 11 million would be received before the end of May, and then the final portion in a year's time. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just sort of show you how does that compare to other cities and obviously our closest government agency to in terms of geographically, in terms of the Santa Barbara County. And so here you've got a chart with the two largest pieces of federal funding in terms of recovery and support for local governments. The CARES Act, which was issued a year ago, and the ARPA, which was just last month. And you can see that there's the blue bars represent the allocation anticipated from the ARPA Act. And the city of Santa Barbara there is the third column, is set to receive about 22.5 million. Significantly different with the ARPA versus the CARES is the allocation methodology. And so you can see the county received a reasonable chunk of support from the CARES Act, but the city of Santa Barbara and most other cities did not. And that was determined by the state ultimately for how to send federal funds to cities based on population. And I believe they drew the line at around 500,000 people per city. And so those larger cities received a higher per capita portion of the CARES Act funding. So that's why you see relatively small sums of money, and we received $1.2 million last year. So again, we're looking to receive about 22.5 million in total, adding to the 1.2 million received last year from the CARES Act. Next slide, please. This table here gives you a kind of an indication as to the various federal recovery sources that have been received or are likely to be received. And you can see within there, the American Rescue Plan Act is the largest portion of that at $22.5 million. What I'll say about each of these is that in some cases, the funding has come through the city and then has been immediately sent out from the city to actually support, in the case of the CDBG grants, a pass-through to rental assistance and grants for local businesses. And what's fairly unique about the American Rescue Plan Act funding is that it was written into law that, you know, this could actually be used for state and local governments to actually recover financially from revenue losses. CARES Act was not, we were not able to do that. You had to show relevant expenses. And so that's one of the key differences in how this is applied to state and local governments. Next slide, please. So now this is the extent of the current guidance that we have around what are eligible uses of this roughly $22 million that we think the city of Santa Barbara would like to receive. The law in this area is pretty thin, and we are anticipating some updated guidance from the Department of Treasury that we hope will still kind of maintain the broadness of this. But again, good news currently is that this can be used as revenue replacement for the provision of government services. So that generally means our general fund taxes are going to be eligible for this, to the extent that the reduction was due to COVID-19. Now, of course, we've been before you many times, and we've shared with you how our revenues have dropped significantly, primarily sales tax and transient occupancy tax. And we feel that that's a pretty straightforward story to tell in terms of how those have been impacted by COVID-19. So therefore, we're comfortable that that is an eligible use of these funds. Moreover, just like the CARES Act, it can be used to reimburse for expenditures. And also, it can be used from agencies, if they wish, to assist other small businesses, household hard-hit industries in terms of creating economic recovery. And so you're seeing some of that elsewhere locally. And then another use of the funds is that it's able to be used to provide a premium pay for essential workers, those who've worked during the COVID pandemic. And also, interestingly, it can be used to spend on infrastructure. And these are specifically called out as water, sewer, and broadband. And again, we're waiting for more guidance about what that specifically means. And there will be a lot of agencies who would be looking to see whether things like watersheds and all that kind of stuff would fall into that. But again, this is the extent of the law currently. It was obviously put together pretty quickly, and so a lot of agencies are waiting to see how this will actually turn out. Next slide, please. These are the three things currently we are aware that we definitely cannot use $22.5 million on. So therefore, an agency could not receive that money and then decide to reduce taxes. That is not allowable. And if there was a tax increase that was expected to happen, that would still have to happen. Otherwise, these funds would not be provided. Now, Santa Barbara City is not planning to do any of that. So therefore, we don't believe this is going to affect us. Secondly, they cannot be used to do a discrete direct deposit into any pension fund. Of course, we're not alone in, like many agencies, having unfunded pension liabilities. However, we're not allowed to just take this money and then go and deposit into the pension fund. That would be unallowable. And again, we're not proposing to do that. And then finally, the intent of these funds is that they will be spent or used to offset revenue and can be demonstrated to have been used to offset revenue by the end of calendar year 2024. Again, I don't believe we're going to have any issues with that, given the losses that we've seen and the allocation that we are slated to receive. Next slide, please. I'll hand back over to Mr. DiMartini, who will finish the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Sewell and Mr. Harris. So just to finish off the presentation today, and then we'll turn it over to the committee. Let's talk about the specific impacts to the city of Santa Barbara, and particularly on city's revenues directly related to COVID that we have experienced over the past year and are projected to continue to experience in the coming months. Next slide, please. So this slide summarizes the total largest revenue impacts that the city of Santa Barbara has experienced since COVID began. And we'll start with general fund revenues. And being that Santa Barbara is a tourist destination, and tourist activity basically stopped almost completely once COVID began, and it has been fluctuating ever since. It's probably no surprise to the committee and to the public that the city's transient occupancy tax that is received through hotel occupancy was significantly hit during this period of time. It's projected that by the end of this current fiscal year, that our TOT revenues will have declined by about 24% from pre-COVID levels. This is a significant impact of around $9.4 million. Similarly, the city's sales tax revenue generated from sales, both our 1% Bradley Burns sales tax and also our Measure C district sales tax in total will have declined. We're projecting around $9.3 million, which is significantly less retail and other business retail related activity occurring in the city of Santa Barbara. And then there are a number of other impacts that we have summarized under this departmental revenue section. Examples of this will be we the city had to basically stop offering a number of programs, particularly in recreation and parks programs. And the city generates revenue from offering some of those services. And so that's an example of a program revenue that we were not able to realize during this time. Other enterprise funds were also impacted and related to COVID. There's two listed here, in particular downtown parking. There was a significantly less parking activity going on in many of the city's parking lots because of various stay-at-home orders and people working remotely and working from home. The financial impact in downtown parking projected by the end of the year is approximately $7.4 million. And then in the waterfront, a lot of the city's lease revenue or other activity at the waterfront had also declined, around $2.5 million. It's important to note that the airport did receive dedicated CARES funding allocations, approximately $9.5 million. Mr. Sewell presented that in a prior slide. So we did not include the revenue impact to the airport necessarily on this slide because they have received a dedicated CARES allocation. Next slide, please. This slide summarizes the economic impacts primarily in the general fund. I mentioned earlier sales tax, transient occupancy tax, and departmental revenues. And the main takeaway on this slide and looking at the three charts is that there is a great deal of variability, fluctuation, and this downward trend that we are seeing in the current fiscal year and that we experienced in last fiscal year's budget, particularly in TOT. And you can see that signs are showing some sense of recovery in many of these revenue sources. For many of them, it will be slow and gradual though. And we'll talk about that throughout the budget process in the coming weeks. Particularly on sales tax. Economic indicators really indicate at this time that the recovery will be slow and gradual, and it will take multiple years for the city's retail and sales tax activity to generate more normal levels pre-COVID. It will take a number of years. So the city does anticipate continuing to experience the economic impacts of COVID for multiple years to come. Next slide, please. We've been talking about the general fund reserves in prior budget presentations with both the Finance Committee and the City Council. So just to reiterate, this slide here summarizes the status of the city's general fund reserves over the past 15 years. And that gray line at the top shows what the policy target is set to achieve 25% of reserves for our general fund as required by a resolution adopted by the City Council as our target. And as you can see, during the Great Recession, the city did leverage and use some of the general fund reserves in order to get through that recession period. And then over the course of the next 8 fiscal years, had been continuing to allocate resources to start replenishing those reserves until they were met again, beginning in fiscal year 2015, 2016. And this graph shows that in order to achieve a balanced budget, and it required the use of those reserves pretty significantly, both in fiscal year 20 and in the current fiscal year 2021. And so you can see that gap is now widening, where we are having to use general fund reserves in order to continue to provide the same level or a similar level of services to the public. During our Q2 presentation to the Finance Committee in regards to the current fiscal year projection, we presented to you that the current projection is a deficit in the general fund by the end of the year of approximately $7 million, and basically depleting all of the city's contingency reserves, which will only be leaving disaster reserves available in the general fund. And so it will be a priority and a conversation that we will have with you in the City Council about the plan to replenish those reserves over a period of time. It's important to note that the ARPA funds that are currently being allocated to the City of Santa Barbara would definitely assist and help with the plan that we would need to develop to replenish reserves over time. Next slide, please. There are other impacts related to COVID to the city, which has been discussed publicly with the City Council over the past year. We've had to incur additional costs for many different purposes, many of which are purchasing personal protective equipment or PPE. There are increased costs due to sick leave that are required by federal and state law for the city to be able to allow for sick leave related to COVID, COVID diagnosis or vaccine implementation. And so it's just important to note that there are additional expenses that the city has incurred over the past year plus as well. Next slide, please. And just to kind of summarize, tourist activities were hit primarily the hardest. And so any of the revenue that the city would have realized in regards to tourism activities was hit significantly. In order to balance the budget, we, as I mentioned earlier, required the use of reserves, but the city also took very proactive and hard measures to reduce operating and capital expenditures. Really tough decisions to hold many positions vacant, delay capital project implementation, reduce operating expenditures, to do everything that we can to reduce our budget so that we minimized and were strategic about using the city's reserves. And even with that, it still required the use of reserves in both fiscal year 20, 21, and projecting into fiscal year 22 as well, as indicated in the city administrator's recommended budget. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, one of the primary components of the rescue funds that are being allocated to the city of Santa Barbara specifically, it's used it's a rescue relief package. It's to offset the impacts that we have already incurred or will continue to occur related to COVID due to the loss of revenues to the city. So just to summarize, I presented earlier, the general fund is projected to lose $25 million by the end of this fiscal year. The enterprise funds are expected to lose $10 million for a total of $35 million of revenue loss directly related to COVID. As Mr. Sewell presented earlier, the city is allocated to receive $22.5 million over the course of the next year, directly associated with revenue loss. So as you can see, even with the ARPA allocation, the city will have incurred a revenue loss above and beyond what the ARPA allocation is designed to mitigate. Again, these are estimates through the end of the current fiscal year, June 30th of 2021. Staff believes that there will continue to be economic impacts directly impacting the city's budget beyond fiscal year 21 that will be incurred in next fiscal year and the following fiscal year as well. So with that, staff would like to pose the next slide, please. This recommendation to the Finance Committee, that staff recommends that the Finance Committee recommends to the City Council that you approve of the first ARPA economic recovery payment that is estimated to be $11.25 million. And it's scheduled to be remitted to the city sometime in May of 2021, that it be received into the general fund to restore a portion of the contingency reserves as required by City Council Resolution 12-066. And with that, staff would be happy to take any questions or comments that you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. DiMartini and staff. I'll open up to questions from my colleagues, and I see Councilmember Harmon, you had your camera on first, and then Councilmember Gutierrez. I saw you as well, so you have the floor, Councilmember Harmon.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this overview. I learned a lot. I just have a couple of questions, and I'm not sure to whom this should be directed, so I'll just ask it. But I'm wondering if someone can speak to us a little bit about the spirit and intent behind these local government funds. vis-a-vis the bill? Because I guess one of the issues I'm having right now is if the intent of this money was to go just to replenish reserves, why did they use the CDBG formula to allocate funds? To me, the use of that formula in particular would tend toward the intent to potentially serve community needs in a different way. So I'm just wondering if someone can speak to that, Mr. Casey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Finance Committee Member Harmon. In talking with the League of Cities lobbyist team, who followed this more closely than I think we did, you know, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes in Washington, D.C. when you put together such a massive package like this. They struggled with how to fairly allocate money out to local governments, and they were looking for a formula that just made some sort of sense. And so I think they landed on this just as a formula that's been in use, that they know how the model works and they know how to distribute money from it. So I don't think it was intended as kind of extra CDBG money. We've gotten other CDBG money over the last year designated as CDBG money and use it towards those uses. Here, I think it was just a practical way to use that methodology to distribute the money to local governments.
Thank you very much. And I do appreciate the need to replenish the reserves. So I'm wondering if we make this recommendation, well, two things. First, if we make this recommendation today, what are we locking ourselves into for the second disbursement of funds? And then secondarily, do we have any information about what other communities, particularly in our region, but generally how other communities are using this money? And if we don't have that today, I'd just like to ask that there's just it doesn't have to be super in depth, but maybe just a couple examples would be very helpful when it comes to the full council. Thank you.
Mr. Chair and Finance Committee Harmon, a couple answers to that, to what I know today. First, you're not committing to the second $11 million. We will have a similar process a year from now. It makes sense, I think, to wait to make sure we're going to get it. A year's a long time. You never know what happens. I have confidence that we will, but you never know. Another issue, as staff, we do feel strongly about putting it into reserves. By putting it into reserves, council still reserves full discretion about if they choose to spend it on a priority that you think is appropriate to spend money on. That is your prerogative as city council to do so. So by putting it in reserves doesn't take that option off the table from you. It just puts that conversation of, is this priority big enough that we want to spend money out of our reserves to fund it? And you may very well find something down the road that you want to do that for, and that's totally appropriate. How are other cities in the area? We can find out that information in talking to the other city managers. We have been financially hit harder than any other local government in the Tri-County area, I would say, because of our reliance on tourism as a main revenue source, and tourism by far has been hit the hardest with the lockdown. So some of our comparable cities, Goleta, Santa Maria, and others did not take the financial hit that we did. So I think you're going to see our recommended use of this money to be a little bit different than what they're doing, although I don't know officially what they've done. I know the city managers are going to take a cautious approach to, or perhaps fund infrastructure, which was another priority. But we can do that research and ask what they're doing. But it's just a different, it's a different situation for each city based upon the fiscal climate that COVID has impacted on them. And I think we have been hit harder than most other local governments.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I definitely acknowledge and recognize that in some ways it's apples to oranges, but it would still be very helpful, I think, to contextualize. So appreciate it. Thank you, Chair Friedman.
Thank you. Good questions. Councilmember Gutierrez, so your camera was on earlier. Any questions? I'm not hearing any. I do have a couple of questions. I think you kind of, Councilmember Gutierrez, you have the floor.
Sorry, my computer's a little delayed. This question was from Mr. Harris. I was just wondering, and I don't recall he mentioned it, how he's going to communicate the information he gave to the public.
Yes, Mr. Chair and Councilmember Alejandro Gutierrez, the city has been consistently broadcasting and communicating through our communication channels. using the city news and brief electronic newsletter, as well as our social media accounts, as well as I've been giving a number of presentations to a variety of community groups and kind of constant communication as to the various programs and areas of assistance that is available. And in addition, as I referenced, the various business organizations, business systems organizations, city, and a number of other community groups, we meet bi-weekly and continue to strategize on broadcasting the messaging and kind of co-supporting each other's message. So in addition to the city being a part of that communication outreach, the Economic Development Collaborative, Women's Economic Ventures, SCORE, the county, et cetera, we're all kind of sharing kind of broad across platforms communication outreach efforts.
And how about the bilingual communication that goes out in the community?
Yes, so bilingual. So as part of that, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Gutierrez, part of our bilingual outreach has been both having the city's website is in Spanish. We can turn on that translation icon. So our webpage and all that information is kept updated. And so that information is available in Spanish. And then we've been coordinating, again, through those business assistance organizations, have been having focused webinars specific in Spanish language. So that's been a very constant inclusion method that we've been ensuring that the direct business assistance kind of information, because as you all have kind of gotten the high level today, this very detailed information when you get beyond just the high level of how to actually go to apply for and register for these various programs. And so there's been specific Spanish language webinars and services in Spanish to connect businesses and walk through those assistance programs. And in coordination with the Hispanic Chamber has been a part of that message effort.
Is there a phone number that local business owners can call and get somebody to help them on the other line in Spanish?
Yes, the city, both we have Spanish language speakers in the city organization. So if we're contacted, we're able to provide that assistance. And then the business assistance organizations that were on that one slide, the Economic Development Collaborative, Women's Economic Ventures, and SCORE all have Spanish language services and assistance available, be it email and or a direct phone call.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Gutierrez. I do have a couple of questions. I think they're relevant to the conversation. So I'm going to ask Mr. DiMartini if you could come back on. So I'm going to ask these questions. So the first one is when we're talking about with the projection for the next fiscal year, the reserves are going down to about 20 million as presented here. Are there any other potential expenses that we're looking at that would further decrease those?
Yes, Chair Friedman, thank you for asking that question. So yes, the answer to that question is yes, there are. I will say that the city is currently in the process of updating the current fiscal year projection. We provide a very robust, comprehensive projection to both the Finance Committee and the City Council on a quarterly basis. The next one is scheduled in mid-May. So we will be updating the current fiscal year projection and present that to you in the coming weeks. I will say that there are other expenses that have been known since the last time we went to the council during the Q2 report that will be included as part of our Q3 process. That will include some litigation expenses that the council is aware of, the cost of which will be included in the Q3 projection, and some of those expenses could be substantial. And then I will also mention that on the slide earlier, there were COVID impacts to our revenues outside of the general fund. Those include downtown parking. That includes the waterfront. There are a few other departments that were impacted as well. It's also important to note that the city does operate a self-insurance fund. The city is self-insured. And so when there are additional claims for insurance and our premium costs go up, it does have an impact on the self-insurance fund reserves. The self-insurance fund currently is projected to have around $4 million of reserves in it. and the appropriate level of reserves that should be in the self-insurance fund exceed around $16 million. So that fund is fairly significantly underfunded at this time. And if there was a need to dip into those funds, we would have to tap into the general fund to be able to use funds in the self-insurance fund to be able to pay additional expenses. So there are additional pressures on the city in a variety of different funds that are important to note in regards to the decision before the committee today.
And so it'd be safe to say that it's not just the 20 million out of 33 that we're looking at with these general fund reserves, being that the general fund reserves are the backstop for other departments that are also having their challenges, some of it related to COVID and others are structural. And so to have the general fund reserves gives us that more of a cushion to address these, such as the self-insurance fund, which is, as you just said, I think, trying to do the math in my head, 12 million, I think you said 4 and 16, so 12 million there. And how is that, for the public, how is that funded, the insurance fund?
Sure, Chair Friedman. So the city, as I mentioned, operates a self-insurance fund. The city is self-insured. The way that money comes into the self-insurance fund, it's through a direct allocation from all of the city departments. And all of the city's departments' budgets, it's recorded in their budget as an expense. And so for the police department, for example, there will be a line item in the police department's operating budget showing an expense of, let's say, $100,000 as an expense on the police department's operating budget. That will be a revenue into the self-insurance fund that will be used to pay for the city's annual insurance premiums, as well as any claims that we would need to pay out. So that's how revenue comes into the self-insurance fund. And that revenue has been fairly steady over the years. It has not increased at the same rate as by which the expenses have increased. And so there has been this sort of ongoing issue with achieving the level of reserve that is required to continue to operate that self-insurance fund.
And so that's also general fund related. So there's other general fund implications on that. And then the last question I have, because I think it's important for my colleagues and the public to understand too, is another potential pressure that we're going to be discussing later in the year, I think, is on pensions. Could you speak to that briefly? I guess it gets into the ability to have flexibility on it. So if you could just speak briefly to pensions and any potential implications to general fund.
Sure. Chair Friedman, I'd be happy to talk about pensions just briefly. And we did talk about pension expenses and the pressures in the budget work session that we had with the City Council back in February. And as part of my next presentation before you this afternoon, we will talk about it again, because it is a significant cost for the city currently, and it will only be exponentially growing throughout the upcoming budget years. So the city is a participant in CalPERS, and we contribute to CalPERS, both the employee, the city of Santa Barbara does, and the staff themselves, as part of their paychecks, contribute into the CalPERS pension system. The city's total pension costs are projected to double over the past have doubled over the past 9 years. They're exponentially growing. And there are many reasons why, many of which we talked about during the budget work session. It comes down to the expected rate of return that CalPERS had been able to achieve for their investment strategy. The life expectancy for many of the CalPERS members continues to be longer, and so having to pay out CalPERS benefits over an extended period of time is another factor. But the fact of the matter is that the city has to pay for our CalPERS expenses for our employees, and those costs are continuing to grow at an exponential rate. So that is a pressure on the city's budget year after year that we will need to continue to address.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions at this time. So thank you, Mr. DiMartini. So now I will open it up to the general public. Are there any members of the public who wish to speak to this item? Mr. DiMartini, is there anyone that you see on there that has their hand raised?
Chair Friedman, I am not seeing any hands raised at this time.
Okay, thank you, Mr. DiMartini. So I will close public comment. I'm going to turn it back over to our comment on this item. I'll kick it off just to start and just to kind of frame the issue. So I appreciate Councilmember Harmon's questions because I had those same questions myself. I still have them. in what's possible and what we could use these for. And I was leaning towards perhaps we could have some type of approach where we put most of this in reserves and maybe have some that we can invest in the community. However, I did go over the budget in depth yesterday with Mr. DiMartini, and I'm very thankful that he took that time to go over it with me, because there's all these other pressures that are coming out to us financially that I think we need to be cognizant about for our recommendation today and as the council as a whole. So I'm actually supportive of, based on this information, and much of it was in the presentation today, of putting this full amount into the reserves, the general fund reserves at this time. One, I think it does give us the flexibility if there are certain projects or investments we want to make, we still have that. But for me, it comes down to that our reserves are dangerously low. When you look at our whole policy, we're supposed to be about 33 million. It's projected to be 20 million, but there's other pressures that are further reducing that. So we're actually going into our emergency reserves when you consider that there's structural deficits going forward and into next fiscal year of another 1.3 million or so. And so our contingency is basically being used and going into our emergency reserves. It's just not a place I think we want to be as a community. So, and keep in mind that it took about a decade to rebuild it from the Great Recession. And the reserves policy that we had enabled us to withstand a lot of the pressures from the pandemic better than a lot of communities that we had. We were able to keep a lot of our jobs. We were able to keep our services going. We did have to make some cuts, but we weathered it pretty well compared to many other communities. And we still have that structural imbalance that we're gonna have to address going forward. In light of the questions I just asked, you saw what those other pressures are, so I don't need to go over those again. But for me, I think we really need to see where this summer is going to go in terms of the recovery. We could be in a much better place if our transient occupancy tax and others go up, but until we see what happens, it is prudent to position ourselves to rebuild our reserves so that we can respond to other challenges. And then there's also the unfortunately, we're coming into high fire season starting Monday. So there's that other pressures that we have with fires and other things that we would need to be able to respond to. And we've seen a number of unprecedented emergencies in addition to the pandemic. So that's where I'm at right now in terms of supporting the staff recommendation to put this into general fund reserves and make that recommendation to the full council. So with that, I'll open it up to my colleagues for comments. Councilmember Harmon.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. I will also vote to move this recommendation forward today to have a full discussion. And I really appreciate this. I really appreciate the work of staff over the years to get us to a place of fully funded reserves. I mean, I've never been, or I guess I should say, our whole community has been the beneficiary of those funded reserves over the last few years. In particular, I have never been on council when we've been in a position of trying to build them up. So I do know that it has taken a lot of really focused work to get us there. And we all are the beneficiaries of that. So I do really appreciate it. That said, I'm not sure that I have the same degree of comfort with just putting 100% back into reserves. I think I could get there. And again, I will move this recommendation forward, but there are a couple of things that are weighing on me, and I just want to put them out there in my comments today. They're what I will be considering as we move forward to the conversation in the full council. First of all, our reserve policy is on the conservative end of the spectrum, and I do appreciate what it's allowed us to do, and I love the fiscal conservatism, but it is a pretty high number. And to me, I'm wondering if that target is really where we need as a community to be right now. And along with that, I'm wondering, replenishing our reserves is a worthy goal, but is there something urgent that our neighbors need to help them get through this moment that this money could provide? I guess my concern, I just want to make sure that we're considering what emergency needs may exist for our neighbors and what this money could do to get our citizens through this immediate period as we work to rebuild our reserves in the longer term. So with all that said, I guess I just wanted to point out that I'm still a bit in conflict here. And it's a difficult decision. It's a sobering reality to look at these numbers. I agree with you, Chair Friedman, that it's quite a hole that we have to dig ourselves out of, and that this first tranche of funds would go a long way to doing that. And I'll vote to move it forward. But I guess I just wanted to go on record here saying that I struggle a little bit. I struggle a little bit with putting this into a reserve fund when I know that there are neighbors who are facing eviction or facing an inability to put food on the table. And I worry that we're missing the forest for the trees a little bit when we put 100% of these dollars into a bank account, when we could potentially use some portion of it in a more sort of proactive way. All that said, I know this is what we all struggle with, staff, council members alike, and I appreciate that everyone's been so thoughtful in trying to figure out how to do the best for the most people with this money. And so with that, I will also vote to move this forward with those concerns just acknowledged and on the record. Thanks, Chair Friedman.
Thank you, Councilmember Harmon. Definitely appreciate your comments. I struggled with it too. Like I said in my comments, I was actually considering just that, putting some there, but after having an in-depth presentation, and I think letting the full council have this discussion, I think is appropriate because it could change at the council level. Councilmember Gutierrez, did you have any comments?
No, I think both Ms. Harmon and you said it very well. I'm looking forward for this to have more further discussion for council. So I will be voting to push it forward, but really looking for further discussion.
Thank you. So at this point, Mr. DiMartini, we need a motion to move it forward to the full council. So I will make the motion put into reserves and direct it to go to City Council for full discussion as part of our budget deliberations. Is there a second?
A second. Oh, sorry.
Councilmember Gutierrez, snuck in there. May I get a roll call, please?
Yes, for the motion. Committee Member Gutierrez.
Yes.
Committee Member Harmon.
Yes.
And Committee Chair Friedman.
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously.
Thank you for that. I'll close that item. And we're on to item 2, which is the Finance Committee review of the 2-year financial plan for fiscal years 22 and 23, including the fiscal year 22 recommended budgets.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair Friedman. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Keith DiMartini, your Finance Director. And so today's presentation for the budget will be a high-level overview of assumptions built into the city's recommended budget for fiscal year 2022 and 2023. And in particular, in today's presentation, we'll be focusing on general fund revenues. And primarily, we'll be focusing our time on the city's general fund tax revenues, which are the major components of the city's general fund revenues. We'll spend a little bit of time on expenditures and reserves. We've been talking about them a lot lately. And then we'll go over the budget calendar upcoming for both Finance Committee and the City Council, and we'll take your questions and answers. So just the agenda for today, as I mentioned already. Next slide, please. The focus will be on revenues today, and then we'll go over the calendar. Next slide, please. Just for the committee's awareness and also for the public that are viewing today's presentation, the city's recommended budget can be found at this web location. It's www.santabarbaraca.gov/budget. I'd be happy for staff and the public to access the budget document on that web page. Next slide, please. So now we'll focus our time today really diving into each of the major general fund revenue sources. Next slide, please. So this slide just provides a really high-level overview of some of the major revenue impacts that the city has experienced over the past 2 years, many of which we've been talking about. We talked about it in just the prior presentation as well, and what staff are projecting in the upcoming budget year for these major revenue sources. So first and foremost, as we just mentioned, staff has articulated and presented in the budget a rather significant decline in both sales tax and transient occupancy tax, both over the past 2 years and also continuing in the next fiscal year's budget. And we have a graph for each of these that will show you the trend over the past few years and what's being projected. Sales tax in particular is anticipated to have a rather slow recovery all the way through fiscal year 2024. That's due to many factors, primarily with many businesses continuing to struggle to return to some sense and some level of normal operations. Also, many businesses have closed, and some of them continue to be closed. And so there are just many reasons as to why sales tax revenues in particular will have a slow and steady recovery. Transient occupancy tax, or the hotel tax, we anticipate that tax will very quickly rebound by the end of this current fiscal year and should return to some sort of a normal level in fiscal year 22. We'll go through that in the upcoming slides. Property tax has remained steady and strong and is projected to continue to remain steady and strong. So that is a very positive outlook on property tax. That's really strong for the economy here in Santa Barbara County. And then finally, department revenues. Department revenues experienced a rather significant level of decline. I gave an example on the prior presentation in regards to parks and recreation programs that were temporarily suspended. A lot of that activity is projected to continue in fiscal year 22, with a lot of programs ramping up. Many people are getting their vaccines. Social distancing still continues, wearing a mask, but a lot of activities are able to continue, and that's projected in fiscal year 22. Next slide, please. This is the same slide I presented at last week's City Council meeting, which summarizes the revenue trends over the past 3 fiscal years and what is being projected in fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 23 for general fund revenues. As you can see, the largest singular revenue source in the general fund does come from property taxes. That's the third line right there. It's projected to come in around $42.3 million in fiscal year 22. And you can see where sales tax falls, Measure C sales tax, the city's transient occupancy tax, and there are a number of other taxes and other revenues that come into the city's general fund. And at the end of the day, the city is projecting just over $166 million of general fund revenues in fiscal year 22. And you can see that's an increase of just close to $15 million from the current year. As you can see, the current year and the prior few fiscal years have been significantly low and depressed due to some of the major changes and decline, both in sales tax and transient occupancy tax. Next slide, please. So now we'll go through one slide per major revenue source and talk about some of the high level trends. So first, let's talk about sales tax. The graph on the right shows around a 10-year or so, a little bit less, of a trend of actual sales tax revenue in blue. The peach bar is staff's current fiscal year projection for sales tax. And then the 2 bars on the right are what is being projected in the 22 and the 23 recommended budget. So as we discussed earlier, sales tax had been declining in recent years, or it's been sort of steady, kind of also declining, primarily with the shift of focus from retail activity at traditional brick and mortar retail establishments and shifting to more online retail, primarily through Amazon purchases. There was California regulations that were passed in 2019 for online retail sales, which really ensured that we are receiving the city's fair share of sales tax generated from online retail activity. COVID had a significant impact on sales tax activity throughout the city. We were projected to receive about 13% less sales tax revenue in the current fiscal year compared to pre-COVID levels. As I mentioned earlier, economic indicators are suggesting a slow and steady recovery that we are already starting to experience in the current fiscal year, which is a really great sign. But we are cautiously optimistic that will continue, and it will be slow and steady through fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 23. You might see a sort of a blurb in fiscal year 2019, sort of an upward tick compared to a lower one the prior year. That was an adjustment with the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration. That's the regulatory agency for sales tax. There was a delay in some sales tax remittances to the city, and that was felt statewide due to some system implementation issues. at that agency. So there was no other real reason for that blip other than just a timing issue for when the city received its sales tax. Next slide, please. This slide summarizes the sales tax revenue that the city gets from the Measure C district sales tax. That district sales tax took effect on April 1st, 2018, after the voters approved it back in the November 2017 election. The sales tax trends for Measure C generally follow the same sales tax, the Bradley-Burns 1% sales tax. It has felt similar impacts due to COVID as well. And again, you can see how the sales tax revenues came down both in fiscal year 20 and 21, but are projected to slowly and gradually ramp up over the next few fiscal years, consistent with economic indicators that we have been reviewing. Next slide, please. Now we'll move on to property tax. And you can see this graph here on the right shows a very healthy, strong upward trend of property tax revenues for the city of Santa Barbara that we have experienced over the past 9 years or so and are planning to continue to experience. There really has been no direct or significant impact to the city's property tax revenues related to COVID. The greater Santa Barbara area continues to remain strong with property and home sale activity. The number of sales and the median home prices both hit records in calendar year 2020. The California CPI is one of the factors that impacts the amount of property tax revenue that is projected to be realized. For the first time in a while, that CPI index is a little bit less than 2%. And usually it beats the cap at around 2%. And so that's a very soft sign of a little bit of a sort of a softening of the real estate market, but not really. The economy here and the real estate market in particular continues to remain strong based on all of the economic indicators that staff has been reviewing. And that growth is projected to continue. Next slide, please. Now let's talk about transient occupancy tax. Again, this is more commonly known as the hotel tax or the bed tax. And this tax is paid by people that stay in a hotel. The hotel collects it, and then the hotel will remit that TOT tax to the city. It had been steadily growing and had kind of remained strong over the past 5 years or so. But as you can see, when COVID first hit back in March of 2020, it significantly fell to basically next to no activity, no hotel occupancy. And so therefore, the city received no TOT revenue when that occurred. And then there had been fluctuations with hotel occupancy and the average daily rates for people that were staying in hotels during that time and on to through the end of 2020. And then things are starting to pick up. Things picked up fairly strong in March with spring break activity and the weather getting better. And just the accessibility of Santa Barbara for neighboring larger cities like the Los Angeles area and San Francisco, people being comfortable driving to Santa Barbara to stay in hotels, but maybe not yet feeling comfortable flying, both domestically or internationally. And so this continues to be an area that staff are looking closely at and reviewing the TOT trends, and there's definitely showing upward mobility. And in the recommended budget, it does assume basically rebounding and seeing more normal levels pre-COVID starting in fiscal year 22. Next slide, please. The next major revenue source for taxes in the general fund is the city's utility users tax. This is a tax paid by people that use utilities, such as water and electricity and cable. The impacts really have not been felt due to COVID. There was initial thinking that maybe the tax revenue would go up if more people were working remotely, but there really just was sort of an offset of sort of less utility usage in certain places like businesses and sort of increasing in residential, but sort of the net effect was really no major impact. This revenue source has been stable and is projected to remain stable throughout the years in the recommended budget. Next slide, please. This is a slide on the cannabis tax. This tax really was first implemented in late 2018, really started in 2019. And as you can see, since 2019, we have experienced exponential growth in that revenue source, but that really is attributable to just the ramping up of the few cannabis businesses that are now operating in the city of Santa Barbara. We have seen significant growth over the past few years, but those businesses are now established and they've been operating, some of them for a few years now. And so staff anticipates that this revenue source will level off and it will become more stable. And it's being projected to be around the $1.8, $1.9 million level on an annual basis going forward, barring any other change in the industry here in Santa Barbara. But we expect that to sort of level off and become sort of a more normal level going forward. Next slide, please. This slide summarizes the business license tax that we receive in the general fund. As mentioned during the budget work session back in February, we have over 16,000 registered businesses that can do business here in Santa Barbara. Many of those businesses unfortunately have closed or have either permanently or temporarily due to COVID. And because the city's business license tax is based on prior year's gross receipts, we do anticipate that the tax revenue will be lower, and it might continue to be lower for a period of time as businesses continue to find their way and open up, which may take a number of years. And so you can see in the recommended budget, there is a continued decline, sort of a leveling off of that declined new level throughout the recommended budget, which we hope will ramp up sometime after fiscal year 23. But it's important to note that we are projecting a decline in that revenue source. The last, next slide, please. The last revenue source I wanted to highlight for the committee today is the city's franchise fees. These are fees that are charged to operators for the right to use the city's right-of-way. And so an example of that might be cable TV or electricity or natural gas. And so the operators of the city's right-of-way pay a franchise fee to the city of Santa Barbara to allow them to use that right-of-way. And so this trend shows what the franchise fee revenue has been over the past few years. And as you can see, it's a fairly steady source. There was a downward trend in fiscal year 2016 and then an upward one in 2017. Similar to the sales tax revenue trend that I mentioned earlier, it was a little bit more of a timing issue where there was some uncertainty in regards to a portion of a franchise fee that we were able to realize in fiscal year 2016, and that worked itself out in 2017. So it was just a timing issue. You can kind of level that off, and if you were to do that, you would see that it's a very constant, steady trend for the city's franchise fees. Next slide, please. There are many, many other individual discrete revenue sources that go into the general fund. And it would take quite some time to go through each one of them in detail. And so this slide here just lists a number of them. We won't be going into them in much detail today. We'd be happy to provide more detail if the committee would like to do so at a later time. It includes real property transfer tax, and then a number of departmental revenues from the police department, community development for permits and other applications that are submitted to community development for applications, park and recreation programs and classes, investment income, fire inspections, and the list goes on and on. And so there are a number of revenues, and many of these will be discussed with both the Finance Committee and also with the City Council during upcoming departmental presentations for the budget in the coming months. So more information on this will be forthcoming. Next slide, please. So today's focus is primarily on revenues, but we felt it would be appropriate to talk just a little bit about some of the expenditure pressures that are included in the recommended budget and what impact that is projected to have on reserves. And again, a lot of this will be discussed in the upcoming budget sessions with you, primarily with departments, about specific programs or specific pressures they have for continuing to operate the programs that they do. But just at a very, very, very high level, salaries and benefits make up the largest piece of the pie. At just over 68% of the total general fund budget is for salary and benefit costs for staff. And as we mentioned in the presentation prior, pension costs continue to be the most significant rising cost in our general fund expenditures. I mentioned earlier that they have more than doubled over the past 9 years. And this graph on the on this right-hand side shows that the city's pension costs by fund. The green, the sort of light green color on the bottom is the city's general fund. The blue color is the enterprise funds, and the gray color are some of the other funds where we have staff. And as you can see, that trend is showing exponential growth in these expenditures, and it's projected to continue through the budget years. And so staff will be working on a budget management, on a pension management strategy that we'll be working with the Finance Committee and the City Council over the next number of months to understand ways in which we might be able to control for and plan for and manage the city's pension related expenditures over time. And so we'll be working on that, and we'll be excited to bring that to you in the months ahead. It's also important to note that inflation is a factor in the city's revenue budget projections for expenditures, and the cost for implementing capital projects continues to increase, both from the use of materials and construction related expenses. The costs that are included in the recommended budget are rising at a greater rate than the base revenue that we have in the general fund. In the prior slides, you saw that the revenue source that's experiencing the most stability and the most increase comes from property tax, which is great to see, but it's just one source of all the other sources of revenues that we rely on to deliver services to the public. And many of those other sources are experiencing some decline or some sort of slow and steady recovery. And so we continue to need to grapple with that trend in the recommended budget with you. And that's really why over the past few years, and being proposed in the recommended budget before you for fiscal year 22, staff is recommending a number of budget expenditure reductions so that we can realize those expenditure savings in order to help balance the budget. Next slide, please. So the net effect of understanding what our revenue trajectory is for fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 23, and what some of the known increases to the city's expenditures are to continue to deliver services, we are able to understand what the impact on reserves are. And we've been talking about this a lot lately because it is really important. This graph shows you, similar to what we just showed earlier, what the reserve target should be in our general fund, that red line, and what the actual reserves are projected to be, both in fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 23. And so as you can see, we've been able to steadily grow those reserves post the Great Recession, but now we have been needing to dip into those reserves again in order to help balance the budget in the last few years. And there continues to be this gap between what the policy level of reserves should be and what the actual reserves are projected to be. So that will be something that we'll be grappling with and discussing with both the Finance Committee and the Council over the coming weeks. Next slide, please. So I'll just go over the next upcoming key dates for the budget calendar. Next slide, please. Today, we presented to you an overview of the non-departmental general fund revenues. The next session with the Finance Committee will be held on May 4th, and that's where the Finance Committee will receive information from general fund departments on proposed fee changes. Next slide, please. On May 11th, in red there, will be the next Finance Committee meeting after that, where you will hear both outside budget requests from outside entities, as well as any fee changes being proposed by enterprise fund departments. Next slide, please. And then finally, on May 18th, there'll be a Finance Committee meeting to follow up on any staff recommended adjustments to the recommended budget. And then you'll have an opportunity to deliberate and make some decisions and recommendations to the full City Council. Next slide, please. And then the City Council will receive those recommendations on June 9th and deliberate. And then the full budget is scheduled to be voted on by the Council on June 22nd. Next slide, please. So the recommendation before the Finance Committee today is to hear a report from the staff on the general fund non-departmental revenues, including growth assumptions, and the general fund multi-year forecast in connection with the committee's review of the proposed two-year financial plan for fiscal years 2022 and 2023. That concludes my presentation. Be happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. DiMartini. And we don't need a vote or anything. This is correct. We're just receiving it.
That's correct.
So I will open up to questions from my colleagues, Councilmember Gutierrez, Councilmember Harmon. Any questions? Hearing none, I will now open it up to public comment. And are there any members of the public who wish to speak to this item? I'm not seeing any. Are you, Mr. DiMartini?
Chair Friedman, I'm not seeing any hands raised at this time.
So I will close public comment. And are there any further comments from my colleagues? Seeing no lights turned on, I just want to really thank you, Mr. DiMartini, and all your staff for putting together these budget projections and all the work you've done. It's been a very challenging year and a half with these and constantly changing numbers and unprecedented projections that you've had to make. So I appreciate the detail of information and outlining the things that we're going to be considering at future finance and coming into our budget season. So with that, there is no further comments, no vote need to be taken. So I will adjourn the meeting and see you next week.